Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Community-Based Learning for Working with Refugees and Immigrants, a Trauma-Informed Approach. My name is Sabrina Dimitra and I'm AMSA Settlement Coordinator. I will be going through a few housekeeping items before I hand the webinar over to Diana Jeffries from Pacific Immigrant Resources Society, also known as PRS, who will be leading us through the content portion of today's event. And so now I would like to hand the webinar over to Diana Jeffries from Pacific Immigrant Resources Society, also known as PIRS, to introduce herself and to lead us through the content of today's event. Diana?
Oh, thank you so much, Sabrina, and thank you to AMSA for having me here today. It's a great pleasure to share the work that I'm doing with PIRS and out into the community. So just to give you a little bit of a background about me, I've been, working with newcomers, particularly with refugees, for the past 20 years in my professional life, but also, in my personal activism, working with refugee groups and individuals. And I started off working at ISS of BC, where I worked with in English language classes, working with people who have multiple barriers, particularly in low-level English classes. And I also worked at ISS with women's support classes, where helping newcomer women who had experienced domestic violence, and then also with refugee youth programs. So I've had quite an extensive experience with them. And then it took me out to Surrey, where I was working a lot more with the Syrian community out there. And I've landed now at PIRS full-time, where I work as the training manager for the organization. And I also do in-person, in-service workshops in and around the country. So PIRS, just to give you some information about the organization itself, we work with partnerships within the settlement sector. We provide English language classes for women, and we focus on women who also have young children. So we provide the English language classes and some employment programs and opportunities for women with children, but not exclusively. What is unique about our English language classes is that we always have childcare attached to it, but we also allow younger children into the classroom with their moms. We also really look at learning and being in the community, and all the work that we do, all of our teachers, all of our childcare workers, all of the practitioners, outreach workers are trauma informed. And so that's the model and the lens that we always look through with the work that we're doing, whether it's childcare or whether it's an English language class. Another thing that's kind of unique about the PIRS classes is that we also have multiple levels within the same class. And we partner in community so that we can go out to meet the needs of the women in the community rather than they coming to us. So with that said, I want to just go over what it is that we're going to be talking about today. So I've done the introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about community-based work in settlement, and what is trauma, how does trauma look in the classroom environment, what it means as a practitioner to be trauma-informed. So that doesn't mean just teachers, but settlement workers, outreach workers, childcare workers, anybody that is working in settlement. What is a good curriculum model for trauma-informed practice? How can you create an inclusive learning space for those with trauma? What is post-traumatic growth? And what are some ways to practice self-care for you? Because that is obviously a big issue when you are working with vulnerable populations. Community-based work in settlement is really looking at how PIRS is is a really good model of this, and I think that we're looking at kind of ways that we can go out to the communities to provide services rather than asking community members to come to us. So, some of the principles in adult education are learning in people's local communities in using real-world tasks, so that people can have a sense of meaning and purpose. adults really tend to learn well if they are in the community and things make sense to them from the perspective of where they're living. So addressing the emerging needs of newcomers to a community by being there in the community for where they live and the experiences that they have. So, for example, if a teacher is trying to teach students about reading a bus schedule, for example, it is better to use the bus schedule that's in the community where people live rather than just a standard bus schedule that you might find in Vancouver. So we're really kind of focusing more on the unique needs of that particular environment and where people are coming from. I think that another thing that we look at, particularly at PRS, is learning about the mutual learning between the learners and the providers. So, we work not just with the teacher and students, but we're also working with community partners, and we also support researchers that want to come in and do qualitative studies with our students, and hoping that there's a kind of a mutual beneficial relationship with those kinds of practices. So partnering also with academics and community groups and community organizations has been really helpful to broaden the capacity, not only just for our students, but also for us to learn about what are the needs or what are the unique needs of people in particular communities. It's also really important that we understand and share the knowledge that is between each other, which is created and formed in a really, positive social interactions with other students, community members, and teachers. So looking at not just the classroom as a place for learning and the teacher and the other students are places for learning, those are obvious, but also how do they extend that to beyond those confines, but looking at further partnerships with other organizations. For example, you might have a class in a neighborhood house, but the students in the PRS class might also belong to other pieces, other groups within the neighborhood house, or their children might be going to the same school where their moms are actually learning in the adult education program that's in the same and on the same premises. And those kinds of sort of really engaging, socially inclusive wraparound services that we can provide in community are really the best way for people to find a place to settle and to learn. Another principle of adult education is that for adults, learning really does need to be experiential, and anybody who is a link teacher, for example, will know that, the sort of the PBLA model is all about that, real world tasks, learning through experience, learning in the community, and those that is all part of community-based work in settlement. I think that one thing that also needs to really be addressed more than ever is that, the individuals that we have in our language classes in settlement have different ways of learning. And whether you're talking to clients or whether you're talking to students in a classroom, you need to really recognize that learning is done in very unique ways by each individual person. And so working with that understanding, and one of the things that you will also find is that learning can be quite inhibited by people who have experienced trauma. And that's one of the things that we want to talk about so that we can continue to be open and inclusive in our classrooms and in our community work. And that we can think about how we can make broader connections. So the barriers through community practice, through the settlement work done in localized communities can be mitigated by working with community partners and helping people to get the kind of services that they need all around. So I want to talk now a little bit about what trauma is. And this is a quote taken by Judith Herman, who wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery. And I'm just going to read it out to you. So what is trauma? Traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary system of care that gives people a sense of control and connection and meaning. Traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptation to life. They confront human beings with the extremities of helplessness and terror and evoke the responses of catastrophe. So I think that's a really good quote to sort of unpack this idea of what we're talking about when we think about trauma that exists in community-based settlement work. I'm just going to sort of unpack that quote by talking about how, as Judith Herman says, trauma is common, and in the sense that it is intergenerational, meaning that you can have people that have, a good example of this might be Holocaust survivors and their children. So Holocaust survivors have experienced an intense trauma, but their children also experience trauma, and that's what I mean by intergenerational. There's also collective trauma, which is when, a whole cultural group may experience trauma through a war. And then there's the individual trauma that oftentimes in our own culture, in Western culture anyway, that people sort of really think about it, but just understanding that trauma is not something that is just for the individual. It is also can be experienced by a group, and it also is multi-generational. Trauma is also overwhelming. It inhibits a person's sense of control, connection, and meaning to life. So even, a forced migration journey or an immigration to Canada itself can be a traumatic experience because people do lose a sense of control. They don't have the language. They don't have the understanding of how the culture works. They don't have the resources to figure those things out. So there's a lot of loss of control. People don't have the connections that they once had in their own community or back in their own first country. And then, the meaning of their life can be really uprooted, and they're not sure of where and how they are going to move forward in this new environment that they found themselves in. So just even the idea of, being forced to flee, being forced to move is a trauma in and of itself. It's not like people aren't happy necessarily to be here, but when it's not been a choice, it is extreme. It's a really terrifying and a traumatic experience to find yourself being forced to leave from one place and leave the culture that you've known all your life to suddenly come to a new culture and starting all over again. Traumatic events are extraordinary because they overwhelm a person's ordinary adaptation to life, to daily life. And it also confronts a person with a sense of terror and catastrophe. So, in my own experience of working with refugees and having seen, people that may have come here 10, 15 years ago, I remember very clearly one student I had. I mean, if you dropped a pen on the floor, he would jump out of his chair. And he had been in Canada for about 10 years, and he still struggles with the trauma that he had experienced from 10 years ago. It doesn't go away, but there are perhaps ways that people can learn to live with the traumatic experiences of their life. We also want to just recognize that trauma is not just something that others experience. I want to also suggest that we've all experienced trauma in one form or another. Certainly, I have not experienced trauma such as being in a war or being forced to move, but I have had those experiences of loss and pain and struggle and those are the same kind of feelings that all people have. So it is not considered to be unique in a sense. So what does trauma look like in a daily life? So this is not, these points that I put out here are not something that, it's a one-off experience that a person is irritable or angry and therefore they have had experiences of trauma. It's not what we mean. It's more about the consistency that you might see in a classroom or even in childcare, or working in the community with newcomers and refugees, like outreach workers may see people with these kinds of experiences. And certainly these are things that I have seen in my classrooms. So irritability and being angry and able to sort of cope with those kinds of stresses, difficulty focusing due to high levels of anxiety, sort of leaving and coming back and that kind of thing, needing to go out and have a cigarette, come back, go out again, come back, and not being able to settle. Easily startled by construction and loud bangs or loud noises. And even, as I say, the student that I had who, you dropped a pen on the floor and he'd jump out of the chair, it doesn't even need to be that loud. It's just those kinds of experiences. There are triggers. Those, you never know what it's going to be, but there are triggers that people experience, and often loud noises can be a trigger. Staring into space or at the window, so that sort of brain fog or that, that blank look that you may have seen that people get, where they're just not really able to stay present. Being forgetful, constantly forgetful, not something that is a one-off, but just a continuous sort of pattern of never being able to remember things. This can be something that I have seen often in language classes where, you can spend years trying to teach somebody their phone number, and getting them to really take that in can take a very long time, and it can be as a result of trauma. So big gaps in memory, not remembering a certain time period in your life, quick to tear, needing a lot of your undivided attention. So that can be, I've seen that many times in classrooms where, a student or, a client may feel safe with you, but they have this need to tell their story again and again and get you to really listen to them again and again. They're sort of in this constant loop of experiencing their trauma over and over. An obvious one is difficulty focusing due to lack of sleep and nightmares. And often, with the medical model related to trauma, that doctors will prescribe sleeping aids, antidepressants, that kind of thing, which actually inhibit people's ability to learn. So they are maybe necessary, but they're not a really great help for people to move forward. Substance abuse, which is kind of an obvious one. We see it in our own communities. People have experienced a lot of trauma in their life and become addicted to, narcotics, drugs, alcohol. I've even seen, for example, a student in a youth class that I had, and he was addicted to water in the sense that he just really, the soothing thing for him was to be constantly drinking out of a water bottle. And he, it was very noticeable that this was his way of coping with the stress and his own anxiety of, first of all, being in a classroom for the first time in his life, to being in a totally new environment with people he didn't know. Hoarding food, classroom supplies, such as pens and pencils. This could be as a result of scarcity. Maybe they have at one point in their life not had food, and so when you have it, you keep it. And shame and guilt. And I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of shame and guilt. And I'll give you a second just to think about what you think the difference is between shame and guilt. Maybe you can see in my very simple drawings here of what shame and guilt may look like and how they are often very related to people's experience of trauma. So when we think about what the difference is between guilt and shame, you can see maybe from the drawings that guilt is really related to or focuses on our behavior, whereas shame is the belief that you're not good enough, that you're not worthy enough. And these ideas come a lot from Dr. Brené Brown, who talks a lot about these ideas of shame and guilt. And they are really related to for a lot of people who have experienced trauma. And it's also a very, very common and usual experience that we've all had. They are not unusual, especially in cultures, and many are, where there's a lot of sort of social control. I think that we're getting better at not having a shame-based culture. But if you think about how we have often been taught in schools as young children, we often were made to feel shame about not being good enough. And certainly in our culture as well, we have things that make us feel ashamed. But the difference between guilt and shame is that shame is much more internalized, whereas guilt is much more about a bad behavior that perhaps you can overcome. When I say that shame is more internalized, it also means that it is more harmful in the sense that it is more difficult to overcome. And it can turn into things like anger and rage, fear, a disconnection with others, and perfectionism. Those are some of the results of having a lot of feelings of shame. And if you think about the people that are coming here from countries perhaps where there has been war, or they are made to feel less than because they come from a country that is, in violence, or they're coming from a religious, have been religiously persecuted. There can be like an internalizing feeling that they are not able to belong. And people, this is such a huge human need, this idea of and a yearning to belong. And that is what that inhibits our ability to move forward. And it's really as a result of shame. Guilt for people also is obviously a real thing. And people coming through forced migration journeys, say to Canada, for example, may feel guilty because they have left family members and friends behind. Why did they get out while others are still in their first country? And those experiences are real, and they play out in people's minds all the time. Whether they're learning English in a classroom, these things come up. Or if they're triggered in a classroom by feelings of shame, these things can come up. And then you will see things like anger and rage or disconnection and feelings like they don't belong. And that can also happen in a classroom. And so it's very important to really recognize how it is that you are working with your community partners, your clients, your students, and to not be exposing people to feelings of shame or guilt, because there's a lot there for a lot of people anyway. So what does it mean to be trauma-informed? So being aware that people have experienced trauma, and this can have negative consequences on learning, which requires people, so whether it's clients or children or adults, anybody, that students, that your practice, whether it is as a outreach worker, a childcare worker, or an English language teacher, that you need to be creative in your approach. I think that oftentimes we think that people will learn in all exactly the same ways, and they just don't. And people with higher levels of trauma will have more difficulty learning new concepts and ideas, because some of that ability to learn may have been stunted. It's really important to also take a moment to ground people to the present. Take some time. I used to do this in my classes, so I would start every class asking the students to stand up, do a bit of stretching, and then do 3 deep breaths in and through the nose and 3 deep breaths out through the mouth, and slowly breathing out and just paying attention to that breath. There's something about that very mindful activity that doesn't take any great deal of time, but is certainly a powerful way to help people to feel more grounded to the present moment. It's also, as we all know, working in community, working as in settlement, it's important to establish good, positive, honest, and open relationships, so they don't just see you as separate from them. So having your clients and your students know who you are is actually a really important piece of feeling of belonging, because that's really also a big part of community-based practices, that we are helping people to feel more like they are belonging. So for them to know a bit more about who you are, to share your experiences with them, to be positive with your students, to not see yourself as other, to not see these hierarchies. They may be used to those, but in terms of adult education, those hierarchies don't work in a way that having a more flat sort of structure where we're all here learning, that you as an instructor or you as an outreach worker are learning just as much about them as they are about you. That's really helpful to create that sense of belonging. And also to obviously never judge or use, and always using non-threatening and non-judgmental tones, answering any questions that people have very calmly, and working in partnerships with support and settlement workers and managers. So also just knowing that you should never be just thinking about your job as it's exclusive, but that you work with other people in community. And that's also, again, those partnerships and community-based learning is what's really important. Active listening, listen without interruption by paraphrasing back to what a student or a client says of what they have told you. And active listening also means to not give advice and show empathy and rather than sympathy. So again, talking back to Brené Brown, who talks a lot about this, the difference between empathy and sympathy is a really important one in this work. And it means basically that it also has a lot to do with shaming people. So when you add this idea of something tragic has happened to somebody, and you say, oh, I can't imagine what that must feel like. That's the worst thing. I don't know what I would do. How awful. I can't imagine being you. That is sympathy, but it is also a way of treating people as the other, as the outsider. And it's a much better approach is to have empathy. And that doesn't mean to say that you understand exactly what somebody is going through. You may not have yourself been through a war, and you would never, you don't say, I understand, I know exactly how you feel when you don't, but that you do understand feelings, that you do have feelings of sadness, of betrayal, of loss, of joy, of happiness, of friendship, of love. And by bringing people on into this idea of being more empathetic, that you share the same feelings as others, is a much better way to get people to feel more engaged and more supported than just feeling sympathy for somebody where they are always seen as the other. And that sympathy often makes people feel very small and very disempowered. Whereas if you can stand in the space with somebody in terms of their feelings, and show empathy, that is much more emboldening and helping people to move past their trauma, their experiences of hardship. And also taking a cultural humility approach. And I will come back to that because it's kind of a newer concept. Rather than a cultural competency, we're looking at cultural humility. And it's kind of a new term that's being bandied about, particularly in the health sector, since people are working with newcomers. So I'm going to go on to the PRS Framework. And this was created by Dr. Amy Wilbur and myself. And it is what all of the work, as I say, that PRS does and focuses around, whether it's working with our women in community-based English classes or in childcare centers, in the childcare sector. And we've put this framework based around Judith Herman's work herself on control, connection, and meaning. So when you look at, for example, control, it's this idea that there is a sense of agency, that people have their own feelings, that they're in control of mind and body. There's an emotional regulation. They experience their own self-talk. They have their own experiences, decisions for oneself, and gives them a sense of safety. So when people have control over their mind and body, then there is that kind of sense of safety and understanding. We want to think about in terms of the brain, feelings, right? Like when people's lost sense of control often, or have experienced trauma, people's feelings can be kind of very out front and center. And that's really because the emotional brain is taking over from the rational brain. So there's been a lot of work done by various researchers and physicians and in psychology and around like how the brain develops. And the back part of the brain is the emotional part of our being, and that is the more sort of basic, what we're born with, and the brain kind of develops and grows through time as we age. But as with young children, they are working completely on emotions, and it's often kind of irrational, and that's why sometimes people find it really difficult to deal with, to work, to cope with children's irrational part, because everything's about feeling. So, they drop their ice cream cone and it's like, the world is going to end, because because children don't necessarily have the capacity to rationalize what's happening. But as you grow older, the prefrontal cortex of the brain starts to develop. And I understand from a book that I read called The Body Keeps the Score, and now I can't remember the name of the author, but he writes a lot, Von Kilner, he writes a lot about the prefrontal cortex and its brain development. And they actually say that it actually continues to develop up until the age of 25. So that rational part of the brain is fully formed quite a bit later in life. But that is the one that is, that rational thinking processes that we have is sometimes stunted by experiences of trauma. So helping students to be able to cope with feelings by identifying what their feelings are can really be helpful. And that also will help to engage people in a sense of having control over their own lives. The next part is connections, and that's really a lot to do with about what we're talking about in terms of community-based learning. Students or clients will connect with teachers, even front office staff, classmates, their friends in the community, management in a settlement agency, childcare staff, and settlement workers or outreach workers. those connections for newcomers are extremely important, mostly because it helps them to not only identify with just perhaps their own family unit, but broaden the scope of their connections out into the wider community in a safe space. So the classroom, for example, is such an amazing place where students can not only learn English, but they also have opportunities to make real positive connections, which is such a huge need for all of us in a safe space where people can accept them for their differences and teachers can accept them for having the unique needs that they may have in a classroom. So first you have control, and then you have connection, and then the last part is meaning. So when you think about meaning, we're thinking about what are the next steps in a person's life? What are they going to do after they finish their language class, or once they finish this community program that they've been in for the last 6 months? How are they going to move forward? So we're thinking about what gives people meaning. The community can give people meaning, whether that be your cultural community or your classroom community. Your work gives people meaning. Spiritual practices are often a source of meaning. Friendship, culture, love, health, relationships with nature, your adventures. What are the things moving forward beyond the classroom and beyond what gives you a sense of control? What is the third step in moving forward with your life? And I want to suggest that in curriculum, for example, with teachers, when they're thinking about themes that they might have in a classroom, so for example, maybe you are discussing family, for example, or maybe you are discussing transportation even. Think about how does that give a person a sense of control and or a sense of connection and or a sense of meaning. So if you're thinking about, as I talked before about a bus schedule, reading a bus schedule will help students to give them a sense of control. They can take the bus places, they can have some agency in where and when they want to go. Connection, just being in a classroom with other learners can help give students a great sense of connection. And it is really incumbent on teachers and outreach workers to help those students to make connections in the classroom. And certainly at PRS, it is one of the things that we think is just as important as language acquisition is, social adaptation and helping students to be in a class and helping people to make connections, just because that in itself is such a basic human need and it can't be overlooked. And it's something that we all have an ability to do when we work in the community. And certainly looking forward to what's going to happen next in people's lives. So that's where you think about meaning. So I suggest things like doing vision boards in a class, going out and having experiences like field trips, going to parks and doing your class in a park, or going on a walk with a client, and really learning about new ways of being in the world, having experiences with nature, thinking about friendship or a new cultural identity. Now you're in Canada, helping our newcomers to think about those things, to reinvent themselves in a way that gives them meaning that maybe they have lost in their migration journey to Canada. So I want to just talk a little bit about the practical strategies and also talk a little bit about some practical strategies. So when we're looking at, these kinds of relationships that we want to have with people, and I have said before, be aware, recognize those symptoms of trauma that people may experience and think about how it is that you can help them. by looking at things like the breathing activities, grounding people to the present, establishing good, honest, open relationships, and not judging, answering any questions calmly, practicing and working in partnerships with other agencies and managers, and practicing active listening and practicing cultural humility. When we talk about cultural humility, this is a quote that I'll just read. Cultural humility can be seen as a lifelong process that involves self-reflection and self-critique. Learning from and actively listening to diverse points of view, building partnerships with communities, and showing a willingness to negotiate mutually acceptable alternatives to communication, engagement, and education. So rather than thinking about, how competent you are at understanding other people's cultures, which is, impossible in a sense. People will say, for example, talk about Syrian culture. Well, there are, many cultural differences. There are other languages, there are other religions. There's not a homogeneous kind of identity that all Syrians have. Just the same as in Canada, we have multiple identities. So rather than really trying to box in what is a culture, it's better to really look at it in asking more questions and coming from it from your place of being having some humility around not really knowing and not totally understanding where other people are coming from. And the only way to really practice this is to really be listening and to ask more questions than to assume anything about somebody who comes from a certain part of the world, because what is very minimal compared to what is reality. So really asking a lot of people more questions about their specific cultural identity rather than making any kinds of assumptions. And that's what cultural humility is really about. And then when we talk about active listening, I often do this kind of activity in a class, and I use a string. And what I'll do I'll take just a piece of twine or string that you have, and I will tie like 3 or 4 knots on the string. And then I have the student sort of think about whatever it is that you're talking about. So say, for example, one thing that's really a good thing to practice is practicing gratitude. This is a really helpful piece for supporting people who have, a lot of have experiences of depression and anxiety. This can be really helpful to practice gratitude. So, for example, I might take the string and I'll put my fingers down the string, and when I hit one of the knots on the string, so I've tied 4 knots on the string, and I go down with the string and I hit one knot, and I say one of the things that I'm grateful for. So I'm grateful for my health, I'm grateful for, my family, I'm grateful for my job, and I'm grateful for my friends, for example. And then the partner then does the same thing. So they don't do the same thing, but they then repeat back to their partner what they heard. And that's a kind of way of getting them to learn how to paraphrase, but also connecting them with sort of a more intimate conversation about things that they're grateful for. And it's also helping the other person to listen actively without making comment, without giving judgment, without having anything, that allowing that person to take the space and for their partner just to be in the space without interruption. So it's just a really good sort of classroom activity that you can do. The idea of using the string is kind of based around a lot of sort of spiritual practices that different cultural communities have, such as, rosaries in Catholicism or thinking beads in in Islam. And, Buddhists have another sort of string activity that has the same kind of idea of it being a sort of therapeutic way of talking, but not also, having the comfort of something to sort of base around what you want to say. So that's just an activity that I really highly recommend because people really like it, and I think it just helps to have the other person to really hone in and listen, and for the person who's speaking to really think about and reflect on what it is that they're saying. When you're looking at a trauma-informed environment, so this is looking at things like classrooms, office spaces where people are coming in to talk, try and, if you can, to be aware and see if you can offer some of these kinds of, solutions to helping people to deal with trauma. Reduce environmental stress or stimuli if possible. So, a quiet office space where there isn't, a lot of loud noises, that kind of thing. Keep the doors and windows open if possible. People often feel that closing doors and windows can feel like they're, imprisoned, like they're imprisoned in a space and that there's no way out. That can be a big trigger for people, so being aware of that. Allowing clients to feel free to take breaks or step outside. And I think that this is also kind of something that sometimes teachers struggle with because, it's challenging as a teacher to have people coming in and out of your classroom all the time. My suggestion with that is also to, help students that are really having trouble grounding themselves, to offer them, time when they can step out. So give them in 5 minutes or in 10 minutes, take a break. So having lots of breaks between activities, allowing them to leave and come back as they need to. And, if you are trying to talk to a client or a student about personal issues, maybe it's sometimes better to be out of the institution itself, going to a park, taking a walk. This can really help to manage people's levels of stress and certainly anxiety. So being in nature is super, super helpful. And if there's a park nearby that you can take somebody to talk about stuff, that's even better. Even if it's a cold day, it's worth going out. The David Suzuki Foundation did a study on health, mental health, and positive outcomes. And they said that being in nature for just half an hour every day greatly reduces people's sense of stress and anxiety. And so taking that into account and knowing that just changing space can be really, really helpful to, calm nerves and bring people down and back to the present. And certainly people who are triggered because of trauma will have those experiences. So acknowledging that maybe you need to recreate experience outside of the place where they've been triggered. If it's possible, provide a quiet space in your agency. So I know that I have, this can be a struggle for settlement agencies and community-based spaces, but even if it's a chair in a corner, just giving a place for people to have some time to collect themselves. And think about the lighting in your workplace, if possible. This isn't always possible, but if a bright light, sometimes that lighting can be really challenging for people. And instead having, lamps with dimmer lights can be super helpful. So I want to talk a little bit about post-traumatic growth as we come to the end of this presentation. So when we're thinking about trauma and how devastating it is for people, I think that it's also really important to recognize that, the resiliency of the human capacity to overcome incredible stress and incredible trauma is really quite astonishing. And what comes out of that is this resiliency to survive. Post-traumatic growth is defined as the experience of individuals whose development, at least in some areas, has surpassed what was present before the struggle when crisis occurred. The individual has not only survived, but has experienced changes that are viewed as important and that go beyond the status quo. Individuals have described profound changes in their view of relationships, how they view themselves, and their philosophy of life. So if you're thinking about how, trauma is greatly negatively affects people, and suffering is is a traumatic experience, but also what comes out of that is a deeper sense of what it means to be alive, and a deeper sense of learning how to connect and being in the world in a different kind of way, that they have grown in their ability to overcome, and they have understood what it means to be incredibly resilient. And that can give people a real sense of development, and a new kind of look on life that is deeper and more meaningful than what they had before. So it's important to not just see people who have experienced trauma as weak and unable to move forward. The human capacity to overcome is great, and the resiliency that comes out of suffering is very profound. And I've seen it within, the students that I have worked with and clients that I've worked with. And I think that it's something to really consider and honor our clients and students that have those kinds of experiences. But as a result of hearing many stories, and I have heard many, many tragic stories of loss, of suffering, of people who've lost, loved ones, they've lost children, or parents, and it's incredibly difficult. So how do you, as practitioners in the community, deal with things like burnout and compassion fatigue? So burnout reduces, we talk about it quite flippantly, but it's a real thing, and people feel it very deeply, and it just means that sometimes people burn out and they can't do the work anymore. Compassion fatigue is one of several terms to describe the effects of working with people in pain or who are traumatized. It results in the loss of the ability to nurture. It's also kind of part of the silencing effect, which reduces people's sense of empathy. But knowing that these are all really natural and stressful, but also preventable consequences of helping people who are suffering. And how do you prevent that from happening? Well, we have ways of doing that. I think you should really consider your own practice of self-care. And, people throw this around a bit, but I think it's also really to take ownership that really you have to look after yourself before you can look after anybody else. So pace yourself. Practice breathing exercises. So mindful meditation, if you can do it, there's lots of podcasts available. One person that I really like, Tara Breck, she does a number of podcasts out of the States. She does sort of 1 hour sort of lecture, and then a 5 to 10, 15-minute mindful meditation. Very, very good. Take a breather. So if you're a teacher and people are just really, it's just been a hard day for you, take time, step outside, let your students do an activity on their own. You don't need to be on as much sometimes as you always think to. Recognize that you also need to take steps to look after yourself. Know and respect your limits. Ask for help through your agency, through your community practice, wherever that is. Talk to managers, talk to co-workers, get the help that you need. Practice relaxation, maximize days off, don't do things that are related to your work. You're not really able to ever save anybody, so making sure that you know that is important. but you are there as part of a community to support each other. Make lists and set goals for yourself. I find that really helpful, just to sort of regain a sense of control if things are getting overwhelming. Speak to your manager if you can't manage what's happening in your classroom or with your clients, and recognize that self-care isn't always possible. So if you have young kids or you have, older parents that you're also having to care for, sometimes, self-care can seem like, oh, this is just another thing I have to do. Just know that, sometimes that's not going to happen for a while, and just be okay with it. That, especially, I think this is particular sometimes with women, they feel this need that they need to also, go to the gym and go to yoga classes or whatever it is that they do, or make sure that they get out for a 1 hour walk every day. And when they can't do it, it's another stress in people's lives. So just know that that's not always possible. You can't always do it. And the last one is when we talk about having an ethical practice. So there's been some work around this, and I think it's really interesting that if you think about your work and what you can do, what kind of capacity you have to support people who are in crisis or who have experiences of trauma, and if you're in a position where you're like, look, I'm too busy, I really can't talk to you right now, you have to you know hand them off to somebody else, or you can't follow through with what it is that you really ethically should follow through with and take responsibility for. If you can't do that, then you aren't able to practice your work ethically. And that is one of the leading causes of burnout. And I think for me, it's something that I've always wondered about myself. It's like, am I kind of like nuts for being able to not be crazy after hearing all these really tragic stories from people's lives? Like, why am I able to cope with this? And part of it is because I always I do my very best, is what I can do, to follow up with that person, to make sure that I'm referring to the right organizations to get them help, to make sure that I'm checking in with them the next day, or to make sure that I actively listen to their stories and practice that kind of cultural humility, so that I am doing the best work that I know how to do, and I'm getting the support that I need to be able to make sure that the work is ethical and it's not unethical. I'm not just going, well, it's not my problem. When you practice ethically, I think that there's a greater capacity for any of us to be better at our jobs and not to burn out, because we know that we have done what we should do for that client or student. So, just in the last slide here, this is PRS has this community-based training guide, a trauma-informed approach, and you will find some good practical strategies for working with clients, working with students who have experienced trauma. And there's some theory, and there's the framework that Dr. Amy Wilbur and I created for this resource. PRS has a number of resources that are available through AMSA, BCTO, and PRS websites. So please feel free to make sure that you access those if you are working particularly with the refugee community, and certainly with people who have experienced trauma. So I'm going to just end it there and see if you have any questions, and I can do my best to answer any questions, or if you have comments you want to say.
Thank you so much, Diana. Thank you for sharing also all of your practical activities, particularly around the active listening. And so one question that came up around the active listening was, if you're the individual who's taking part in this exercise with somebody who has experienced trauma, and you are doing the gratitude exercise, how can you say, oh, I have a house, or I have a home? How can you ensure that you're not re-traumatizing or kind of, occurring that you're mindful of how you take part in that gratitude
For
exercise?
sure. No, that's a really good question. And I guess what I mean by that is that I would first of all, these are kind of, you know, exercises that you might not practice on the very first day of meeting somebody. And also I would ask that person to perhaps share with you things that they feel grateful for. It might not be at that particular time when they're in a moment of crisis that they're going to be able to acknowledge what they feel grateful for. But if they're in a calmer, safer space to do that, then invite them to share with you what are the things that they feel grateful for. That is often a way of helping people to feel better about their lives, knowing that they do have things. They do have you as a teacher. That would be something that maybe they'd feel grateful for. The fact that they have a certain level of physical health that they can feel grateful for. Their English class, maybe, and the friends that they've created in that English class can be things that they can think about gratitude for. And when you're thinking, it's really important that you talk about yourself in terms of things that people can identify with. So, yeah, I never talk about, I don't actually even talk about family because I know that sometimes people don't have family or they've lost family, and that can be a real trigger for people. When I was a teacher and I would talk, there was a theme on family, I would always put it in the third person. And what is in one of our guides is talking about family in terms of, I would use the royal family as a way of explaining if you were doing a unit, talking about, who is your mother-in-law and all that kind of stuff. The royal family, because they've, got divorced and, marriages and widows and all of those kinds of, grandparents and great-grandparents, that kind of thing. And it's not because I am particularly interested in the royal family. Sometimes people are because they're kind of celebrity, but also it's just a way of keeping the personal out of it. And sometimes people don't want to talk about those things, especially if they have experienced trauma. And you will know that by really, really knowing who your students are. So when you don't have to do gratitude with the string when you're doing active listening, it could be things like, what did you do yesterday? Or what are 3 things you love to eat? Or, what are 3 things you love about the community that you live in? Keeping things lighter can also just be, more engaging and fun for people. But also, that intimacy between two people in a classroom, whether it's a teacher and a student, or it's between students to students, can also be, a nice way for people to connect.
Thank you so much, Diana, for talking and explaining some other ways. And there was a lot of positive comments about this activity, and many have said they're going to be using it with friends or with other colleagues who are going through different things. One question that we received is, could you please revisit and elaborate on the difference between sympathy and empathy?
Sure. So if you think about, we obviously feel both. They're both very common and honest feelings that people have towards others. But I think when you're talking to people who have or who are in crises or are going through a traumatic experience or who have gone through traumatic experiences, knowing that there's nothing more isolating for people than when when they feel vulnerable and then they're made to feel even more alone because it's something that you don't relate to. So when I say things like, oh, you poor thing, I can't imagine that happening. I don't know what I would do if that happened to me. That's sympathy. And as much as that may be a feeling that you have around that person or towards that person, it might not be the best thing to how to share to be and be supportive. It's much better to be empathetic and to find within yourself those same feelings that person has that you haven't had, and you never, you don't consider that you've had the same experience as another person, but that you have feelings because you're just a human being. So, for example, when somebody dies and you say, I'm so sorry, I can't imagine, that must be the worst thing in the world, they're going to feel more alone. They're going to feel like the outsider. But if you are coming at it with, I'm so sorry, I don't know how you feel right now, but I understand that you are feeling really, really sad and alone or afraid, and I just want to be here with you. That is more sympathy. That is not treating somebody like the other. That you are with them. You're not on the other side of them. So it's sort of like the same way as sitting beside somebody rather than sitting across from somebody. So when you sit beside them, there can be a feeling more of we're in this together, even though you don't have those same experiences or the same feelings of loss. But you can save that space for that person and just be there with them, and that is much more helpful.
So thank you so much. And I think this is, we have another question from a language instructor. I think this ties a little bit to what you just said. They mentioned that one of the tips you gave during the webinar was never to judge and to use empathy when working with people who've experienced trauma. How best can I use these tips when assessing my students' language development? Sometimes, no matter how hard I try to be holistic and growth-focused, the students feel guilty for not improving faster.
Yeah, I mean, just really recognizing, first of all, that feeling guilty is just a human feeling. That I think that sometimes people coming from different cultures where teachers are it's very hierarchical, and they are doing the work for the teacher rather than for themselves, and that can be a real shift, especially in adult education, where they're not there to please you, and they shouldn't be feeling guilty because they've made you upset. It's putting the responsibility for learning on the student, but also, knowing and being encouraging that the next time that they do the task, that they will, hopefully improve. And if it's not the next time, it'll be the next time. So it's just that kind of being that positive affirmations that this is just a moment in time, especially if you're doing like things like PBLA. There's other chances, there's other opportunities to do assessments where students can be successful. But also recognizing that guilt is just a human emotion. We all have it, and it's kind of also a way of, it serves a purpose in the sense that when you do something that's not great, that maybe the next time you won't do it again. So that's what the purpose of it being in our conscious is there for. It's so that we can self-correct, and that's kind of what you kind of try to get across to the students. I know it's really difficult, but just, talking about maybe there's something else going on for them that is triggering this guilt, but knowing that maybe that they can talk to you about it can be helpful as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Diana. And somebody else was asking for some tips or some suggestion on how they can be mindful and assist and help and support a refugee who's experienced trauma when they right now themselves are going through a hard time as they've lost a family member.
So when
the helper, the person who's helping is going through
their
own personal
challenges,
at the same time looking to assist and support the refugee who has experienced trauma.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you have to recognize that you only have a certain level of capacity when you are also going through a traumatic experience. You need to go through that, and so in the sense that you have your own way of moving through that, and hopefully in a better place in time. In saying that, that's when you really need to reach out to the community. You need to reach out to your managers, and you need to reach out to other people that are working with you to help you with students that may need support. And also really being, sometimes it can be really a moment for you to share, if you feel comfortable sharing with the person that you are also going through a difficult time, and that maybe you're not the right person to talk to. But that's what I mean by, it's not all on you. It's an organizational, it's a collective kind of thing that we're doing here. You shouldn't be working completely in isolation, and you need to make sure that you get the support from managers and other people on your team to help you with difficulties that you're having, because it's never just going to be you that's doing this work. So.
Well, thank you. And from the other side, somebody who's a manager has asked, I oversee and also work with staff who are on the front lines, who work with children who've been exposed to trauma. How can I best support staff who are feeling very heavy working with these children? In other words, they are losing the vision of the big picture of helping that child grow and are becoming overwhelmed with what the child has gone through. And in the process, they're losing their role.
Right. So it's almost like a burnout kind of thing as well, where they're losing their capacity to care as much as they maybe had once done. I think that really for managers to offer a safe space for people to share their feelings for frontline workers, because it's a really demanding job. And as somebody who's been on the front lines for many, many years, and actually I really miss it in many ways. And but I also really realize now that I'm not on the front lines, as much as I miss it, I also realize how incredibly challenging that work is. So I think as a manager, you acknowledging that your staff are also needing support, and maybe providing things like extra time where they can have share sessions together to hammer out some of the issues that they're having within the childcare center, and seeing if they can do things differently that can better support the childcare workers, to think about that as being just as important as supporting the children. Because again, if staff aren't looked at, being supported or recognized for the incredible amount of work that they do, then the children won't be recognized either. So it really comes down from management to make sure that that you're checking in with staff, you're making sure that there's time for consultation and sharing and PD and opportunities for their own personal growth, so that they can be better at their jobs. Maybe doing some self-care professional development, maybe thinking about not always what's next for the kids, but what's next for the staff, right? Because that will make them better at the work that they do. And I think acknowledging the real challenges of that type of work, and knowing that you have their back is super helpful. And I know that was something that has been very helpful for me, knowing that there are other people out there that acknowledge this work, know that it's what I'm doing is good, making sure that I feel good about who I am in the job that I'm doing.
Well, thank you, Diana. And another question that came up was around ethical practice. And so the individual says, I completely agree that ethical practice is self-sustaining in a sense. It's the driver. However, I also see it contributing to burnout, as it demands a level of service that is not always possible, especially depending on the size of a settlement worker's caseload. Do you have any thoughts or comments around this?
Well, I do. I think that that's where, advocacy for yourself, for your work, is really important. I think what I mean by having an ethical practice is not just you as this individual, it's on an institutional level. The systems that are in place for you to do the work have to be there. And that's part of your ethical practice. You can't do it properly if you don't have the backup. So again, it's going back to the higher ups in the organization, advocating on behalf of the people that do the work that you do to say that we also need support, and if we don't get it, then we can't do this work in the way that it should be done. And sometimes I think that we think it's all on our own shoulders, and it really isn't. So having the courage to go and talk to managers, directors, or whoever, EDs, executive directors, and to say that, okay, we need things to change because I need to make sure that I can do this work the way it's supposed to be done. And if the systems aren't in place to do that, then, and it's falling on me as an individual to always to figure it out, then that is going to lead to burnout. So it isn't about you as an individual making sure that you do an ethical practice. It's also about the organization in itself. And I think for me, where it came from, I guess I just had a certain level of confidence that I just knew what I needed to do, and I kind of did what I needed to do, and management would support me on it. So I kind of just took the steps I needed to make sure that I could meet the needs of my students, and then reported back to management on what kind of things that I had done to do that kind of thing. So getting the support from the system, from the institution itself, is really where I would start. And not just talking about it, but actually doing it, going, presenting, and also with possible answers to some of the issues that maybe the organization is having around burnout.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that's really important conversations that need to occur within the organization.
Yeah.
And so another question that came from an individual who's supporting refugees, saying, how can I assist and continue to support refugees, particularly and when they're feeling guilty that they've left family members behind, maybe in a war zone or still in a refugee camp, and that the news that they hear about the instances that their family members still go through, when that keeps reinforcing the guilt or reliving the trauma that they've experienced.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really difficult and sad part of our modern culture, that social media plays such an active role in everybody's life. It doesn't even matter if you have literacy skills or not. Often people have no ability to use the internet, but they do know Facebook, and they do hear and read and see stories about what's happening to their loved ones, their communities back in their first countries. And it is there, as I say, what are you going to be able to do about that? There's nothing you can do about that, but you can provide a safe space within an environment. So a classroom, for example, is what I know, where people can come together and just have a break from all of that, have a break from of the overwhelming feelings of guilt that they have about being here, or thinking about how they can't afford to send any money back to their families back in their first countries, those kinds of things. Whereas if they have a space in a classroom or in the community where they can just have a moment of peace from those kinds of feelings, where you can provide an environment where it feels cozy and safe, and where people are supporting each other, and there's laughter and friendship, and maybe doing activities that provide a sense of hope. That is truly one of the best things that people can have. Often I think better that, not maybe better, but not all of us, certainly not refugees, can afford or have the cultural understanding of things like having individual therapy. But a classroom can provide that, and it's often just that moment of relief from those really really difficult feelings like guilt and shame that people have, that they can find a space of peace and some happiness for a few moments, a few hours a day in a classroom. So that's one of the unique things about community-based learning or being in the community and working with newcomers is that you can create these really special places where people can have a relief from the daily grind of memory and loss and the sadness that is very real for them. But at the same time, it's not something you can, that's a human condition. Guilt is a normal condition of being alive, and you're not going to fix that for them. You just can relieve some of that momentarily for them.
All right, thank you, Diana. Somebody also asked, can you provide some suggestions on how to support clients emotionally, particularly when they have minimal English skills?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, sometimes, so I used to work with pre-literate learners, and they had very few literacy skills, including, oral skills. But I think that it's things like creative practices. So I used to do a lot of art in my classes. I used to do things like vision boards, collages, ways that maybe sketching and drawing and those kinds of activities that are very kinesthetic, where they're able to sort of do more reflection. It's more quiet, but they have time to think about what it is that is making them feel better, or thinking about moving forward with their lives. Those kinds of things can be really helpful. I especially like things like collaging and vision boards, talking about the future, of what they would like to see happen for them, or where they're heading. I used to do a lot of collective activities around that with lower learners. And one thing that I did with the English class at PRS, in the refugee English class, is a collective collage on where students found refuge in their new community. So they were all living at the time in Burnaby. Most of the students in that class were from Afghanistan. And I basically just asked the questions, where do you feel safe? And they looked in magazines and cut out pictures of places that helped them to feel safe. And they also wrote a word. So it could be with my husband, or my child, or it could be in my bed, or in the bathtub, or in a park, or just a word that helps them to find a place where they feel safe in the community. It's just helping them to not just reflect on, okay, well, where do I feel, safe here? And where is that place of peace and comfort that I look to? And it's also working with other, in this case, with other women in the classroom. They were also able to share with very little English. They were still able to share what it was that they were feeling, and how they and learning a few words at the same time. Anything that is sort of kinesthetic movement can be very helpful, especially for people who have experienced trauma. Different textures. I would do things like take my class to the park and get them to take their shoes and socks off, stand in a big circle, and just get them to feel what's under their feet and between their toes, and going, what's the sun on their face, the leaves when their eyes are closed, and the shadows on their eyes of the leaves between the sun flickering, and all of those experiences. That kinesthetic experience can be really powerful when language is not an option.
Well, thank you, Diana. And before I go to the next question, I just wanted to note the time that it's almost 11. However, Diana has agreed to stay on to continue answering questions, and we do have quite a few still.
Okay.
Could you please share a little bit more about trauma not necessarily being unique? You mentioned at the very beginning that loss, pain, struggle can also cause similar feelings. Could you expand on that?
Well, I think that we've all, what I mean by, people who have, in our culture, at least in my generation, very few people have experienced war and that kind of trauma in this culture. That is kind of unique in itself, actually. But at the same time, I have experienced trauma. And so anybody who has, unless they've lived in a cave all their life, and then that would provide another kind of trauma, I suppose. But just to be alive is to have suffered at some part in time in your life, whether that be a loss of a family member, a betrayal, a loss of a friendship, anything that has really disrupted the moment, the ordinary sense of rhythm of life is a trauma. So what I mean by you don't necessarily have needed to experience war, and we hope that people don't obviously have to experience that, but you can relate to people in terms of loss, and you can relate to people in terms of sadness, betrayal, anger, all of those experiences you have probably have had, and so you can relate to people on that level. And not to say that you can say, "Oh, I know exactly how you feel," because you don't, and it's taking away the power of their feelings by saying that. But you can say, "I don't know what you feel, but I want to be with you in this space where what you're feeling, because I understand that emotion. I understand loss. I understand pain, and I understand love, and I understand friendship, and I understand, the happiness as well." But because you haven't experienced trauma doesn't mean that you can't understand the feelings that come with trauma, because you have more than likely had experiences of trauma yourself. It's just maybe not in the same way or at the same degree. So I don't know if that answers the question, but you can maybe write back and ask me again if it doesn't.
All right, I'll keep my eye open for that.
Okay.
One question that came from a LINC teacher was, I'm trying to integrate trauma-informed principles in my work.
Mm-hmm.
As a LINC teacher, whether students have identified traumatic experiences or not.
Mm-hmm.
However, sometimes learners are resistant to mindfulness activities such as breathing or taking in nature, and they want results and PBLA assessments, and they want to see that they're proceeding in their language learning.
Mm-hmm.
And how can I get more trauma-informed practice buy-in for my students, particularly in these situations?
Yeah, I mean, that's so great that you are adding this into your practice. I think it's really important that people do, and acknowledging that trauma is not an experience just beholden to refugees. It's people that maybe there's all sorts of people that have stuff that's going on for them, whether they have tons of money or not, or whatever. But I think that yes, there's this kind of push towards wanting, especially in LINC with the PBLA, and there's this sense of rigor and urgency that students can sometimes have, and that teachers are sort of forced to contend with. I certainly, in my classes, I would just spend that 2 minutes of doing breathing activities, and maybe it's like literally 15 seconds at the beginning of the class, and just getting them to take in deep breaths and breathing out through their mouth 3 times, and then getting them to sit down, and then before you're doing an assessment, getting them to do that again, and to really sort of be focusing on their mind-body connection before they do an assessment, and getting them to do thinking about sort of mindfulness and that kind of thing. It does take time, but I think that you will get there in the end. But you also have to kind of be confident in the sense that we're doing this, and the buy-in will come. I think you just have to be persistent. Don't ask them if they want to do it, just do it. If you ask, they're all going to say no. But if you just do it, and I know that in my class, it came to the point where they were like, Diana, we missed the breathing. We need to do the breathing before we start class. So it was kind of funny because, you know, it ended up being that it was very helpful for them. And maybe if they are higher learners, you can explain that, explain the benefits of mindfulness practice for better focus and better acquisition of language, because there's lots of studies out there to prove that mindfulness does help people with focus and you know, getting better results on things like language. So as much as it's for the person who's experienced a lot of trauma, and then other people that have, you know, have feelings of more empowerment, and they don't have the systemic barriers that like people like refugees may face. Just knowing that it's actually really good for anybody. And sometimes it was even me that needed to do it more than anybody else. You know, if it's like frantically doing, you know, photocopying and then coming back to the classroom and being really busy, and then just taking that moment with the class to all come together to do that breathing was just as important for me as it was for anybody else in the classroom. So I would just keep going, just keep doing it, and be confident and sure that this is what's happening. I also think it's important, you know, not to spend your whole class on these things, because yes, students are there to learn English, and that is a big priority. So it's that kind of balance that you need to try and create between language acquisition and social adaptation and self-care, that learning self-care all in the classroom, all at the same time. And that's why it's such a really challenging job, but it's also can be really amazingly interesting and fulfilling. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Diana. And there's another question related to classroom dynamics. Classrooms can be a safe space and an ideal place for refugees, but some classes are very difficult places where some students struggle as they observe behaviors of other students, so they are not always helpful. Do you have some suggestions?
Yes. So yes, and I've seen that. And one suggestion you could try and make with your agency is perhaps creating a class, and we did this at Diversity and at ISS, creating a class for students with multiple barriers so that they would have less students in the classroom, and that they would have a teacher and volunteers or an extra teaching assistant. So there was a lot more support for those students that needed to kind of come out of a typical classroom and go into a more supported environment, and then, you know, once they're more comfortable, to go back to a regular class. So that's one way you can do it. If that's not an option, I really am a big believer, and I know a lot of teachers don't like doing it, but I'm a big believer in having stations and having different activities at different stations, so that students can be more in control of their learning and deciding on what it is that they learn. It's less teacher-centered, it's more student-centered, which is what all EAL classes should be anyway. And that then you can spend the time with the students that need the extra support that other students don't want to work with, in bringing in really qualified, good volunteers into the classroom can also help, giving that kind of attention to the students that are more vulnerable, and partnering up the students that are less vulnerable with other people in the classroom. And then also, like, getting higher learners to work with lower learners, that's also really useful. You can't do that all the time, but at times it might work. You just got to sort of try different things, rearranging the classroom in different ways, you know, desks and chairs in different ways to support different types of learners, and also just being aware that, yes, that sometimes this is what community is, right? We have to work with people that we don't always want to work with, and that's, you know, that's what part of being in a community-based, settlement-based classroom setting is. And, you know, Yeah, so I think that those kinds of tips can be quite helpful. Just moving things around, stations, working more one-to-one with lower learners in the classroom, providing volunteers to work with those kind of learners. Those kinds of things can be really helpful. And on a bigger level, if you have capacity to provide an extra support class for those students that have extra barriers.
So one question that came up from a settlement practitioner is, I, as a settlement practitioner, work with refugees, and I myself lived through a war and lost family members due to a war.
Mm-hmm.
So is it okay if I tell my clients who have come from war zones that I do understand their feelings? Is it okay, for example, that I cry with them when they cry? Is this okay?
I think that that would be a call that you would have to make. I think that you have a potential to re-traumatize people or make it worse. Sometimes people need to come to a place where they are going to be supported. And if you are also falling into your own experiences of trauma, you have to be aware of that. But I also really understand it and recognize that that would be an incredibly challenging place for you to be in. I think that you would need to get some support if that's where you think you are headed with a client, and step away if you think that you're going to fall into re-traumatizing yourself or traumatizing the client that you're working with even further. I think that as much as as horrific as an experience that you have had, to recognize that and also know that when you are working with another person, that they're looking to you as their support, and there's potential that you could end up both falling into re-triggering each other off. So I don't really have a clear answer for you. I think having had the forced migration journey that you've had really is incredibly helpful for doing this kind of work, because you do understand so deeply the experience that people have, but you also need to take care of yourself and make sure that you are not being re-traumatized in the process, because you're not going to be able to, you potentially could burn out from this kind of work if you did do that. So yeah, I would just be very careful for yourself and for your client around how it is that you're going to address the issues. Does that make sense? I think it doesn't help people if everybody is being triggered by, crying and all that kind of thing. Certainly I have cried on numbers of occasions over students that over hearing traumatic experiences from people that I really, really care about. But I've always done that privately. I just think it's important to be the solid one in that relationship, so that you create space for that person to regain a sense of control and over themselves.
Well, and this really leads to the next question of how and when do you suggest bringing in counseling and mental health support, particularly where stigma may exist, but you as the practitioner, as a settlement worker or link instructor, recognize the benefits for a client. How do you include this in community work?
Yeah, I mean, therapy is a really culturally specific experience that, we talk about individual trauma, and we talk about it in terms of, we can do a lot of talk therapy and this kind of thing. And that is for many people just like, what are you talking about? Like, that's the last thing I'm going to do is start talking about my feelings to somebody I don't know. but at the same time, like if people are open to it, and people are open to trying ideas and ways of, improving their mental health, I think it is. I think that you should refer when you think that there's a need and you think that it's appropriate for a client or a student to get better extra support. I mean, as a teacher, you see these people every single day, 4 days a week, or whatever, but you're really the frontline person, or if you're an outreach worker or a settlement worker, that you are seeing them very regularly, and that won't be the case with a counselor. But at the same time, counseling can help people. Also, just I think that once you've established a really good relationship with a certain clients, students, that you can suggest these things. I'd like to refer. And I found that in my own experience, most people are very open to it. Like, oh, that's new. Okay, I'll, that they're kind of interested. Other people are just like, no, that is a source of shame, and I have no interest in participating in sort of therapy kind of model support. But again, it's your classroom that can also, or your settlement agency, or the community work that you're doing, that can really, really be extremely beneficial for people to move forward. And just to recognize that people don't, when they have had traumatic experiences, they don't want to talk about it. They don't need to talk about it. They don't need to talk about it to me or to you or to people, that if they don't feel like it. They often just want to move forward. And sometimes the classroom or, a settlement worker can offer that kind of hopeful place where they can move forward, where they're not expected to relive experiences and, that the trauma that they've experienced, there's no getting over it. They're never going to not have had that experience. It's learning about ways that they can work with it and move forward with their lives. And also knowing that there is this resiliency and this post-traumatic growth that does come out of traumatic experiences, and looking forward to looking at that as methods of moving forward with one's life. So I think it's really also important to not sort of delve deep into people's experiences of trauma and getting them to relive them. Certainly not as you as an instructor and outreach worker. That is something that would be done in a therapeutic setting, in a clinical setting, and would not be appropriate for any of us to take that space. But you are there as a more place of hope and encouragement to move forward with their life and create a new identity, creating a new sense of control, a new connections, and having a greater sense of meaning and purpose in their life. And those are your space where you are working may be the way that a person with trauma can move forward with the trauma that they've experienced, and learn and find better ways of dealing with it. And it might be through therapy, but it could easily also be within a community-based programming that you have, right? Sometimes that can work just as well, if not better. And I think that there's a lot to be said for the kind of work that is done in settlement that really brings community together, and it's extremely helpful and important, I think, for us as a society moving forward too.
Well, thank you, Diana. This question refers back to an example that you gave earlier of a student in your classroom being addicted to water.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, how can I, either as a link instructor or a settlement practitioner, understand between a compulsion that a client or a student may have and an addiction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this person is clearly, water is not an addiction; it's more of a compulsion. But I guess that's good to acknowledge that. Yeah, there, an addiction, cigarettes are an addiction, and drugs and alcohol can be an addiction. But recognizing that need that is oftentimes related to high levels of anxiety. And in this case, this person had lived in a refugee camp for 20 years and first time out, first time in a classroom, first time in a city, never having had those experiences before, high levels of anxiety. And for him, that was just a coping mechanism, right? So it wasn't dangerous for him to be, at that in that way. It wasn't as dangerous as things like drug addiction or alcohol, but it still was something that you kind of had to be aware of and just to be recognized, to find other ways of distractions or other ways that he could cope with his own levels of anxiety. And we did things like in that class, it was a youth class, and we did things like a lot again of kinesthetic dexterity work, like we did mask making and that kind of thing, getting busy with doing things rather than pen and paper and that kind of very disciplined way that people with higher levels of education have, that they can sit, with pen and paper and work and understand these abstract concepts, whereas people that have trauma don't necessarily, it's more difficult to understand abstract ideas and concepts, and actually doing things is much more, it relieves a lot of anxiety for people when they actually have to get busy with mixing and painting or using their hands or being physical. That can be much more helpful, and that's what I kind of did with that class a lot, because they were very young, they were young, and they kind of wanted to do kind of that kind of work. It was much more meaningful for them than just to be sitting around, using a textbook or doing vocabulary or whatever. It just was a better method for them to do project-based learning and art-based learning. So that's how, we managed to get them out of the kind of always feeling that need to have water kind of thing and be satiating himself that way.
All right, thank you. We're going to have 2 more questions, and then we'll be wrapping up the webinar.
Sure.
One is requesting a comment from you, if you could speak to the importance of trained trauma-informed professionals from within the cultural community of the client.
Okay.
Is this something that referrals should be made, should be brought into situations? It's just some questions around this.
What do you mean by the trained?
Yeah, it's just really individuals who've received training on trauma-informed practice, and they're from within the same cultural community as the individual who has experienced trauma. Could you talk about the importance of having individuals who are trained and from the same cultural community as the individual? Is this a benefit, a hindrance?
Right.
How should organizations proceed?
Well, I think that this is kind of, at PRS, we hire from within. Like, we have hired a lot of our staff are from that have gone through our programs, and they have also, had training in trauma-informed practice themselves, and they are from the communities of people that we also work with. I think that there's an incredible benefit to having people that are from those same cultural communities getting the training. It can seem quite like a foreign concept to some people from certain parts of the world, because this is not really talked about. Trauma is not really discussed or thought about in the same way that it is in this culture. But I do think it's an important piece of bringing community together, to recognizing that we are all working in community and settlement, and it's not, Canadian people working with refugees and newcomers. It's actually all people working with refugees and newcomers, and from their own cultural community is just as important as me understanding it as people from having perspective from the same culture. And in saying that also, like, I think that there also has to be a recognition that even though people, again, are coming from the same culture, understanding that they're not the same people, that there might be class differences, there might be a more stratified cultural narrative that is understood in those cultures, and that they also don't necessarily share the same religious practices or have the same experiences of people that are coming from the same culture. So I think it's really important that trauma-informed practice is shared and practiced throughout all aspects of settlement. From people that are also having come here and working in settlement as settlement workers who come from the same cultural background as others, and then also recognizing that cultural humility, knowing that every single person is different, and their cultural experience in a country can be very, very different from others. So I think it's important to have all of that trauma-informed practice for everybody.
Thank you. And the final question is from a language instructor. It says, sometimes I feel students feel more comfortable speaking in their own language and with people of their heritage and religion. I've seen shy students be more open to activities and exercises when they're engaged within their own cultural background. How can I facilitate this with cultural humility and at the same time still provide a Canadian positive experience?
Well, I've come from the thought that I don't mind people speaking their first language in an English class, because I think that sometimes, at least from the perspective of building community and having social engagement and that kind of thing, I think it's okay. Obviously, you're in an English class, so you're doing your best to speak English, and you can do things like, okay, for the next 20 minutes, we're only going to speak English, and then we'll take a break, and you can like rethink or talk to each other about what we've discussed in your own language for 5 minutes. Something like that you could do. I'm not super strict about English only in the classroom, and that's just me. But I say that my intention is because I want people to also have an opportunity to create and form meaningful relationships. And they're going to do that in their first language first. I mean, it's kind of obvious that you would do that. If I moved to China and I was in a classroom only with Chinese people, that would be, I'd learn a lot faster for sure. But I would also, feel like it would be nice to have somebody else that spoke English. So, for that kind of connection. What was the other part of that?
How classroom, just scrolling down to the question. But yes, how can I look to engage students within their own cultural background in terms of exercises and experiences, but at the same time facilitate cultural humility and provide a positive Canadian experience?
Well, I think that just by allowing students to take some time to speak in their first language, I think it's okay. But and in terms of cultural humility, I think thinking about asking them questions about about their own cultural experiences and what happens in their culture, and without getting too heavy on to asking too many questions about people's culture, because after a while it's like understanding that they don't really get a chance to ask you questions about your personal life, but often teachers feel this it's really interesting, and it's also really can be very helpful to know more about your students, right? But there can be a limit to that. You can kind of take that too far by asking too many questions and getting, that's it, because there's a power difference, and they're going to feel a need to explain themselves all the time. Practicing cultural humility is by just understanding that every single person in your classroom has a unique cultural experiences that are different from other people within the same cultural group. So that's what we mean by that, and just not assuming anything about any people coming from the same country. And then by providing good experiences of Canadian culture, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong about talking about what is different about Canadian culture compared to other cultures. Maybe, for example, how people experience their individuality in Canada can be quite unique compared to other cultures where, you know, roles, gender roles, etc., are very prescribed, and in Canada they're not so prescribed. And talking about it in terms of in that deeper level of understanding about cultural differences, in terms of unique differences between individuals, and how Canadian culture or sort of Western culture really identifies more with people's individuality than it does with a cultural group kind of thing. I don't know if that answered your question, but it's a hard one to answer. I think thinking about trying to find opportunities to share about your own cultural experience as Canadian, and getting other people to maybe understand that how heterogeneous, or how Canada is not made up of any one particular culture, which is very hard for people to understand, but that in itself is a culture. Having a multicultural society is a culture in and of itself too. So.
Well, thank you, Diana, for answering all of our questions, and for giving your presentation today. Just before I hand it to you for any last final remarks for closing, I just wanted to mention, because I received this question multiple times, that yes, I will be sending out the slide and also the training guide that Diana mentioned to everyone who registered for this webinar via email later today. As well, this webinar was recorded, and a recording will be posted on the AMSA website. It'll just take a little bit of time, but it will be coming up there. So thank you so much. And do you have any last final words?
No, just to say thank you very much to AMSA for allowing me to take part in this presentation, and thank you all for joining me on this. I hope I was able to answer your questions. It's always you know, sometimes it's easier if we, in a workshop or that kind of thing. And PRS, we do workshops on this this kind of practice. So please feel free to contact me at PRS if you did want a more in-depth in-service kind of workshop on the topic of trauma in the settlement sector. But in the meantime, I wish you all the very best. I think that whatever work you're doing within settlement is an amazing opportunity for you personally, and it also is such a huge support to the people, especially our more vulnerable members of our communities. And I wish you all the best for the great work that you're doing. Thanks.